Hi, and welcome to a podcast about podcasts. Today, you're listening to this podcast as a part of the WebQuest because you yourself will be making your own podcast. The hope is that this will be not only informational, but interesting as well. In addition to learning how to make a podcast, we will discover the cycle of a podcast, how podcasts can be used in the real life, the assignment you will be using to create your own podcast, how that assignment will then be beneficial in your real life, and how a podcast compares to video. Although the cycle is circular and there's not really a first or second or third or final step, I will explain this using the first step as your thoughts. So, the first step of a podcast is kind of you figuring out your thoughts, what you want to say and whatnot. Then, second step of a podcast is you recording your voice, which is what I'm doing right now. Now, the cool thing about recording is that you can do this basically from anywhere as long as you have the appropriate applications on your computer. And honestly, you can do it in whatever room you want, wearing whatever clothes you want. I'm in my pajamas right now and it doesn't even matter. We will go over how to record a podcast later in this podcast, in addition to the use of the website that's on the WebQuest. The third step is putting it onto the World Wide Web. This will let other people from other places be able to explore and find it, just like any other website or picture or anything else you can find on the internet. The podcast from the website will then be downloaded into any application that can read an MP3 or an M4A file, like iTunes or QuickTime. The person who downloaded your podcast can then take this podcast off their computer, put it on their iPod, just like any other song, because it's the same type of file. The last and final step, if you want to call it, in this podcast is your thoughts. Now, the person who has listened to the podcast has their own thoughts about the music, the information given, just like you have thoughts about what I'm saying right now. This can then be made into another podcast and the cycle can start again. Download the handout that's on the website. You can see pictorially what this cycle might look like. Now to talk about how podcasts can be used in real life. Well, of course, podcasts aren't only used for educational purposes. Podcasts are great because you can sign up for them through iTunes and they're free. And what happens is that they will load to your iTunes an updated version of the podcast when a new one comes available. Therefore, if I were, let's say, teaching a class, for example, and I made a podcast every week, well, every time that I put a new podcast up on my website, the people who were listening to my podcast would get this new podcast every week I put it up. It's kind of really cool because you never really have to go and find it and see if it's updated like you might with a video or a TV show that you have to watch. Many of the podcasts that are already made are people talking about the news, people talking about whatever they want. I mean, people out there rant about anything. You could also use it to record a song, and your subscribers would get an updated version of a podcast every time you uploaded a new song. Another way where podcasts can be used is through research. Instead of having a teacher give you a packet to read of different journals or a book to read, they could have you listen to a podcast of a professor that has given a lecture on a certain topic or really anything. It's kind of a cool new way of expanding your research. Your assignment for the WebQuest is to make a podcast describing how you solved your magic square problem with the problem-solving technique or strategy that has been given to you. The podcast will then be given to another student in the class, and they will have to listen to your podcast and see if they can understand how you got your answer to the magic square problem. Now, we all know that the answer is the same no matter how you get it, but the important part is that you have to teach another person how you got to the answer you got to using your strategy. This process itself is very meaningful in your life and in anybody's life. Learning how to explain what you're thinking and being able to express to another person the thoughts that you have are important in any job that you go to, any school that you go to, or any friends that you're hanging out with. In comparing a podcast to a video, All you have to do is think about the advantages of a radio, like being able to listen to it wherever you want and being able to interpret the vocals however you want. If you go to the link on the website, you will see a tutorial through Apple to show how to create your own podcast. Hopefully you have learned and enjoyed all the new information about podcasts.